March 7th, 1945, roughly 3 in the afternoon. A young American lieutenant named Karl Timmermann is standing on a wooded ridge above the German town of Remagen, staring at something that should not exist. Every bridge across the Rhine for hundreds of miles in either direction had already been destroyed. German engineers had been blowing them one by one as Allied forces closed in, reducing each crossing to rubble and twisted steel sinking into the cold water. Hitler had ordered it. The Rhine was supposed to be Germany's last great barrier. And it was. Except here. Here, in the grey March light, the Ludendorff railroad bridge still stood. Its stone towers rose intact from both banks. Traffic was still moving across it. German soldiers, civilians, horse-drawn wagons, even cattle, all pressing east in a desperate column, trying to get to the far side before whatever was coming reached them. What was coming was Timmermann's company. And what no one on either side of that river fully understood yet was that the charges wired into the bridge, 300 kilograms of explosives placed by trained German engineers, were about to save almost nothing and doom almost everything. This is not simply the story of one bridge. It is the story of how the same army that once crossed rivers faster than any force in history ended up, 5 years later, unable to blow them up in time. It is a story about command, fear, fuel, and the way a system built on terror eventually turns on itself. And it begins not in 1945, but 5 years earlier, on another river, in another country, where the Germans were still winning. In May of 1940, the French army stood on the western bank of the Meuse, near the town of Sedan, with what they believed was an unbreakable plan. General Charles Hunziker's Second Army would hold the high ground. If the Germans came, his engineers would blow the bridges, and the enemy would face a wide, deep river with no crossing. The Meuse was roughly 55 meters wide at Sedan. The western bank commanded the approaches. The position looked solid on every map in every headquarters from Paris to London. On the 12th of May, the bridges came down exactly as planned. German armour rolled into Sedan and stopped at the water's edge. The French had done it right, and it made no difference. On the 13th of May, around 1,000 Luftwaffe aircraft flew well over 1,000 sorties above the Meuse sector in an air assault that lasted most of the day, the most concentrated bombardment the world had yet seen. Stuka dive bombers hit French concrete bunkers on the western bank in relays, preventing crews from manning their weapons long enough to cut down the assault boats in the river below. Under that storm, German assault engineers, led by Staff Sergeant Walter Rubath, paddled across the Meuse in rubber boats under fire and knocked out 7 French bunker positions. 6 of Rubath's 11 men were casualties before they finished. He received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for the action. Further north at Dinant, General Erwin Rommel personally organized his troops at the riverbank, standing in the open to direct the crossing as bullets struck the water around him. German engineers worked through the night on both sides of the river. By around 4:30 in the morning of May 14, they had completed a 16-ton pontoon bridge across the river at Gaulier, south of Sedan. By daylight, panzers were crossing and rolling west toward the English Channel. French Army Group Commander General Gaston-Henri Bilotte understood the disaster immediately. He told his staff that across the Meuse bridges would pass either victory or defeat. On May 14, the Allies threw every available bomber at the German pontoons and lost roughly 44% of their bomber strength in the attempt. The bridges held. The French army collapsed. In less than 6 weeks, France fell. What the Germans demonstrated at Sedan in 1940 was something that would haunt them for the rest of the war. A river barrier is only as strong as the army defending behind it. Destroy the bridges, and the enemy still crosses if he has engineers, air cover, momentum, and will. The Meuse should have stopped them. It held them for hours. The Soviet army would learn this same lesson in the worst possible way, just 1 year later. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. In the opening hours, German special forces and panzer spearheads seized Soviet bridges across the Bug River at Brest-Litovsk and across the Niemen at Elytus. The Soviet army in those first weeks was surprised, disorganized, and cut off from its command structure. Units that needed orders to blow bridges could not get them. Units that did not wait for orders blew the wrong bridges at the wrong time or not at all. At Elytus, on June 22, the 7th Panzer Division seized both road bridges over the Niemen within hours of the invasion beginning, racing 60 kilometers from the frontier to reach them before the Soviet defense could organize. The Soviet 5th Tank Division counterattacked from the east bank through the afternoon, but the 20th Panzer Division came up to reinforce that evening, and the bridgehead held. The Germans poured through every gap they found. Joseph Stalin responded by shooting the people responsible. General Dmitry Pavlov, commanding the Western Front, was arrested, tried, and executed by firing squad on July 22, 1941, along with several of his senior staff officers. The charge was cowardice and dereliction of duty. The real reason was that bridges had fallen and an army had collapsed, and someone had to pay for it. That pattern, a supreme leader punishing commanders for lost bridges, would be copied almost exactly by Adolf Hitler 4 years later. At the time, though, the Germans were still the ones advancing, and in the summer of 1943, the war turned. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad in February of that year, and the failure of the great German tank offensive at Kursk that July, Army Group South, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, began the longest fighting retreat in German military history. Hitler's response was to order the construction of what he called the Eastern Wall, a defensive line anchored on one of the longest rivers in Europe, the Dnieper, which runs through Ukraine. In some places, the Dnieper is nearly 18 kilometers wide. Its western bank rises steeply above the flat Ukrainian plain. On a map, it looked like a fortress. Hitler issued the construction order in mid-August 1943. The problem was that the Eastern Wall existed almost entirely on paper. There were no finished fortifications, no pre-positioned supplies, and almost no time. Construction had barely begun when the retreat from Kursk accelerated into a rout. In mid-September, Hitler reluctantly authorized Manstein's forces to fall back to the river. The Soviets did not wait. By the night of September 21 and 22, advance elements of the Soviet 3rd Tank Army had already reached the Dnieper. Opposed in places only by roughly 120 German officer cadets from a flak training school near Cherkasy and the worn-out reconnaissance battalion of the 19th Panzer Division. Within days, Soviet infantry had seized bridgeheads on the western bank. By the end of September, they held over 20 of them. Think about what was happening to the German columns during that retreat. Tens of thousands of men with horses, wagons, tanks, and wounded, all converging on a handful of remaining crossings. Soviet aircraft hunted the bridges in daylight. German engineers sometimes blew crossings too early, before their own retreating soldiers had cleared the eastern bank, abandoning men to captivity or death. Other crossings were lost simply because the demolition parties fled before their orders arrived. The river that was supposed to save Army Group South became a scene of chaos and disaster. Some German units reached the Dnieper to find no crossing at all and had to improvise in full retreat, building rafts under Soviet fire or swimming horses and men across with ropes. The units that reached the river with their discipline intact got across. The ones that arrived in fragments were destroyed at the water's edge or captured on the eastern bank they were trying to leave. 2,438 Soviet soldiers were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union for crossing the Dnieper under German fire, the greatest number ever awarded for a single operation in the history of that decoration. The river that was supposed to stop the Soviet advance had instead become the site of the largest mass award of military valor in the war. Then came February of 1944. German troops trapped in the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket tried to break out across a small river called the Gniloi Tikich. In summer, it is barely a stream. In February, swollen by snowmelt, it ran 20 to 30 meters wide and bitterly cold. The encircled Germans had lost most of their heavy engineering equipment during weeks of fighting. There was no bridge, there was no boat. Soviet tank columns closed in from 3 sides. Of roughly 60,000 men who had been caught in the pocket when the Soviet encirclement closed at the end of January, perhaps 45,000 were still able to fight when the breakout began in the early hours of February 17. In a blizzard and sub-zero cold, 3 assault columns drove west toward the German relief force. General Wilhelm Stemmermann, commanding the pocket, was killed by a Soviet anti-tank shell as he directed the rear guard. When the survivors reached the Gniloi Tikich, thousands stripped off their equipment to swim faster, only to find the water so cold and so swift that many drowned before reaching the far bank. Others were shot by Soviet cavalry waiting on the western side. Some units maintained cohesion and crossed in organized groups. Most arrived in fragments, without weapons, without officers, without any of the organization that had made them soldiers. When the final count was taken, roughly 19,000 men had been killed, captured, or gone missing. The Gniloi Tikich is a river that appears on almost no map. It consumed an army in one night. By the summer of 1944, the war in the West had also reached its crisis point. The Allied landings in Normandy in June had established a firm bridgehead in France, and in August, following the American breakout that shattered the German front, the Wehrmacht in France began to die. The Falaise pocket closed around August 21, 1944. Roughly 50,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner inside it. Approximately 10,000 more were killed. Thousands of horses lay dead in the lanes. Equipment, guns, and vehicles were abandoned in quantities that shocked even Allied commanders who walked the battlefield afterward. General Eisenhower himself walked the ground 2 days after the pocket sealed, and later wrote that the scene could only be described by Dante. What remained of Army Group B fled east toward Germany. According to United States Army records compiled by historian Martin Blumenson, 7 German armored divisions that made it to the Seine got a combined total of roughly 1,300 men, 24 tanks, and 60 artillery pieces across the river. 7 armored divisions, 1,300 men. Everything else was lost on the western bank, captured or destroyed. German commanders later reported that their units arrived at the Seine lacking, in some cases, even the demolition materials needed to destroy the remaining bridges behind them. The engineering corps was gone. The fuel was gone. And the army that had crossed the Meuse in hours in May of 1940 was now an army that could barely deny a river to the force pursuing it. It was in this context that an incident in Cologne in mid-October of 1944 changed the rules in a way that would haunt the Wehrmacht for the rest of the war. An Allied bomb struck a demolition charge chamber built into the Mulheim suspension bridge over the Rhine, setting off the stored explosives and dropping the bridge into the river. No enemy force was nearby. It was an accident. The bridge had been pre-wired for demolition, as all Rhine bridges were supposed to be, and a stray bomb had detonated those charges before any German officer had given the order. Hitler was enraged. He demanded court-martials, and then he issued an order that would help cost Germany its last natural barrier. From that point forward, no German bridge could be pre-wired with explosives until enemy forces were within a specific close distance. Charges had to be stored nearby and installed only at the last moment. And no bridge could be blown except on receipt of a written order from the sector commanding officer. The intent was to prevent accidents. The effect was to guarantee that in any fast-moving situation, the written order would almost certainly arrive too late. Every officer in the chain knew what would happen to him if he blew a bridge too early and trapped his own retreating men. And every officer knew what would happen if he failed to blow it in time and the enemy crossed. There was no safe choice. There was only the choice of which court-martial to risk. This was the system in place on the morning of March 7, 1945, when a column from the United States 9th Armored Division crested a ridge north of Remagen and saw the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. The Ludendorff Bridge was a railroad crossing built between 1916 and 1919, partly by Russian prisoners of war. It was named after the German general of the First World War, who had championed its construction to supply the Western Front. The bridge had been built with chambers designed for demolition charges from the very beginning. During the French occupation of the Rhineland after the First World War, those chambers were filled with concrete. The bridge that Captain Karl Timmermann was trying to destroy on March 7, 1945, had literally been built to be blown, and then rendered harder to blow by the peace that followed the last war. The German command situation at Remagen that morning was a map of everything wrong with the Wehrmacht in 1945. Captain Willy Bratte was nominally the combat commander of the bridge garrison. He had roughly 36 soldiers directly under his orders. A Luftwaffe anti-aircraft unit was stationed at the bridge towers but reported through its own chain of command. Several hundred Volkssturm militia answered to local Nazi Party officials. Captain Timmermann was the technical bridge commander, responsible solely for demolition, operating under different regulations from the infantry officers around him. The corps that had been responsible for the Remagen sector, the 53rd Corps under General Edwin Graf von Rothkirch and Track, had lost its commander the previous night. Rothkirch had been accidentally captured by American troops on March 6 while traveling in the area. The sector was transferred on the spot to a neighboring corps, the 67th, under General Otto Hitzfeld, who was 40 miles away and had never previously been responsible for this stretch of the Rhine. At 1:20 in the morning of March 7th, Hitzfeld dispatched his adjutant, Major Johannes Scheller, known as Hans Scheller, to take charge of the bridge. 8 radio operators were supposed to travel with him. Major Scheller left for Remagen at roughly 3 in the morning, with 8 radio operators in a small convoy. American tanks were on the roads. His column had to detour around them, ran low on fuel, and detoured again to find petrol. The radio truck got separated in the dark and never reconnected. Scheller arrived at Remagen at 11:15 in the morning with no radio, no reinforcements, and no familiarity with the bridge he had been sent to defend. Captain Brache did not even know Scheller was coming until that morning. The explosive situation was no better. Captain Friesenhahn had requested 600 kilograms of standard military explosive to destroy the bridge. He received 300 kilograms of donnerit, a commercial industrial explosive used in mining, significantly weaker than military demolition charges. He placed all 300 kilograms on the southeastern pier. He wired everything to an electrical detonator inside the mouth of the Erpel railway tunnel on the east bank. He ran a manually lit backup fuse to the same charge, and then he waited for a written order. On the American side, Brigadier General William Hoge, commanding Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division, received word from his scouts shortly before 1 in the afternoon that the bridge was still standing. He had been ordered to swing south toward Koblenz. He stopped, looked at the bridge, and made a decision he would later describe as the greatest turning point of his career as a soldier. He ordered the bridge taken. The man who would lead the assault was Second Lieutenant Karl Timmermann. He was 22 years old. He had been born in Frankfurt on June 19, 1922, the son of an American soldier named John Henry Timmerman, who had gone absent without leave from the Army of Occupation after the First World War, married a German woman named Maria Weisbecker, and brought his family back to West Point, Nebraska, in 1924. Karl Timmermann grew up with the shadow of that family history behind him. He had spoken to people back home about making the family name right again. 7 days before this afternoon, his daughter, Gay Diane, had been born in a hospital in the United States. He did not yet know she was alive. At roughly 3:50 in the afternoon, Timmermann's A Company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, reached the western end of the bridge. German machine guns in the stone towers swept the approach. Lieutenant Timmermann stood where his men could see him, pointed at the bridge, and told them they were going across. At almost that same moment, Captain Friesenhahn finally received written authorization from Major Scheller. He turned the firing key on his electrical detonator. Nothing happened. Artillery fire, almost certainly from American guns, had cut the wires somewhere along the circuit. Friesenhahn called for a volunteer to light the manual fuse. Corporal Anton Faust ran out onto the exposed bridge approach under American fire, reached the primer cord, lit it, and ran back into the tunnel. Everyone fell silent. The charge detonated. The bridge lifted. Planking flew. A sag opened in the deck. Smoke and dust rolled across the river. The Americans watching from above held their breath, certain the structure was gone. The dust cleared. The bridge was still standing. The 300 kilograms of donnerit had detonated, but the commercial explosive was simply too weak and too sparse for the task. It cracked one pier and bent the deck. It did not bring the bridge down. The military explosive Friesenhahn had requested and never received might have done it. The donnerit could not. Timmermann's men charged. Sergeant Joseph Delisio led the sprint to silence the machine guns in the stone towers. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, a butcher from Holland in the state of Ohio, led his squad down the center of the bridge at a dead run, shouting as he went. He later told a reporter that he did not stop because he knew that if he kept moving they could not hit him. Drabik reached the eastern bank. He was the first soldier of any army invading Germany to stand on the eastern side of the Rhine since the Napoleonic Wars. Lieutenant Timmermann was the 10th man across, and the first American officer to do it. Behind them, Lieutenant Hugh Mott and his engineers moved across the bridge, cutting demolition wires and throwing German charges into the river. Inside the Erpel tunnel on the far bank, chaos had taken hold. Several hundred soldiers and civilians were packed together in the dark. Major Scheller, who had been in command of the bridge defense for less than 4 hours, took a bicycle from somewhere and rode out the far end of the tunnel to find a working radio. He never returned to the bridge. Captain Bracci tried to organize resistance, but most of the men in the tunnel had never seen Scheller before and had no idea the command had changed that morning. Bracci eventually surrendered to the Americans, along with hundreds of others. By nightfall, American infantry were across the Rhine in force. By the following day, additional battalions had crossed. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, described the bridge as worth its weight in gold. He immediately authorized First Army Commander Courtney Hodges to exploit the bridgehead aggressively, overriding the original plan to focus the main Rhine crossing effort further north. What followed on the German side was one of the most savage episodes of institutional punishment in the history of the Wehrmacht. Hitler immediately fired Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief in the West, replacing him with Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Kesselring surveyed the situation and told his staff that the military position had become nearly catastrophic. Then Hitler created the Flying Special Court Martial West, in German the Fliegendes Sonderstandgericht West. To command it, he assigned General Rudolf Hübner, brought from the Eastern Front, accompanied by 2 lieutenant colonels. None of the 3 had any legal training. 2 military police with pistols came with them as the execution squad. The court opened proceedings almost immediately. Captain Bracci was tried in absentia, as he was already an American prisoner, sentenced to death. Major Hans Scheller, the man who had been in command of the bridge for under 4 hours, who arrived with no radio and no reinforcements at a position he had never seen, who finally gave the detonation order and watched it fail through no fault of his own, was tried and sentenced to death. He was 31 years old. His wife Liesel was pregnant. He had already been in army service for years and had nothing to do with the decision to station inadequate explosives on a bridge he did not know existed until the morning he was sent there. A lieutenant named Karl-Heinz Peters, who had nothing to do with the bridge garrison but had been passing through the area with a battery of experimental anti-aircraft rockets, and whose delay in crossing was judged to have contributed to the bridge remaining intact, was also sentenced to death. Scheller and Peters were taken into the woods near the village of Rimbach on March 14, 1945. They were given a few minutes to write letters to their families. The letters were torn up afterward. They were shot in the back of the neck and buried where they fell. The pension rights of Scheller's widow and unborn child were stripped from the family. They were reinstated only after the war ended. Major August Kraft and Major Herbert Strobel, who commanded the engineering battalion that had installed the charges on the bridge and who had been 40 kilometers away when it fell, were brought before Hübner's court in mid-March and executed near Oberirsen. The trial lasted approximately 20 minutes. On March 10th, in the courtroom itself, General Major Richard von Bothmer, the battle commandant of Bonn, who was being tried for surrendering the city without a fight, seized a pistol from a court official and shot himself. 6 officers had been killed, executed, or died by their own hand as a direct consequence of the Remagen failure. General Hübner, who ordered all of it, survived the war and died in February of 1965. Captain Friesenhahn, the engineer who had turned the firing key and sent a man to light the backup fuse, was acquitted. The court found that he had done everything within his power. He had asked for the right explosive and been given the wrong kind. He had placed it correctly. He had fired it correctly. The system had failed around him, not the other way around. Major General John Milliken, the American Corps commander on the other side of the river, was also relieved of his command by First Army Commander Courtney Hodges, replaced by Major General James Van Fleet. Hodges felt the bridgehead had not been exploited quickly enough. In a single battle, both armies had destroyed the careers of the officers most directly involved. The bridge itself lasted 10 more days. German artillery fired on it continuously. The Luftwaffe flew repeated attacks. German frogmen attempted to place explosive charges against the piers at night. At 3 in the afternoon on March 17, 1945, with no warning, the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed into the Rhine. Approximately 28 United States Army engineers were killed, and dozens more were wounded. The pontoon bridges alongside had already been finished. The bridgehead held. 5 divisions were across. 2 days after the bridge collapsed, on March 19, Adolf Hitler issued what history remembers as the Nero Decree, formally titled Destructive Measures on Reich Territory. The order commanded that everything of military value on German soil be destroyed before it could fall into Allied hands. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, had sent Hitler a memorandum the previous day arguing against destruction of civilian infrastructure. Hitler rejected it and signed the decree. Speer then worked actively to obstruct the order, travelling from garrison to garrison and talking local commanders out of demolitions. What is not disputed is that the decree was largely not carried out, and that this failure was one of the first clear signs that Hitler's authority over the German state was beginning to fracture. The decree came too late to matter for the Rhine bridges. By the time it was signed, nearly every crossing had already been destroyed by retreating German engineers, most of them blown not in defiance of orders, but in terrified compliance with them. Some were blown too early, trapping their own men on the western bank. Others were blown too late or not at all. And a few, like the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, failed even when the order was correctly given and the fuse was correctly lit. 6 months before Remagen, in September of 1944, the Allies had attempted Operation Market Garden, a bold airborne assault on a 62-mile chain of bridges through the Netherlands. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's plan was to drop 3 airborne divisions on a corridor of crossings from Eindhoven north to Arnhem and drive the British 30th Corps up that road, potentially ending the war in 1944. The results showed what the German army could still accomplish when its command was intact, and what happened when it could not coordinate. At the village of Sens, over the Wilhelmina Canal, American paratroopers of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment rushed the bridge on September 17, 1944. The Germans blew it at exactly the right moment, just as the leading American soldiers reached the approaches. A textbook demolition, executed with clear authority, the right charges, and precise timing. One Allied division lost an entire day waiting for engineers to build a replacement crossing. The entire operation fell behind schedule before it had properly begun. That single destroyed bridge did more to delay Market Garden in its opening hours than any German tank. Further north at Nijmegen, the Great Wall Road Bridge was defended by a German battle group under SS Captain Karl-Heinz Uhling with roughly 500 men. On September 20, the 3rd Battalion of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, under Major Julian Cook, crossed the wide Wall in canvas assault boats under direct German fire, while British Guards armoured division tanks attacked from the south. The boats were paddled by engineers and paratroopers alike, in full view of German machine gunners on the northern bank. Men in the lead boats were hit before they were halfway across. Those who made it to the northern bank formed up under fire and assaulted the bridge ramps from below, while the tanks fought toward them from the south. More than 300 of Uhling's 500 men died in the fighting. The bridge was captured intact. Whether the Germans deliberately chose not to blow it, hoping to keep it available to reinforce their defence at Arnhem to the north, or whether the ignition system failed, is a question historians have not definitively resolved. At Arnhem itself, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion held the northern end of the Rhine Road Bridge for 4 days against the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, waiting for relief that never came. Major General Roy Urquhart's 1st Airborne Division had landed too far from the bridge and could not fight through to Frost in time. By the night of September 25, the survivors were ferried back across the river. The division had lost roughly 8,000 of its 10,000 men, dead, wounded, or captured. The Arnhem Bridge was destroyed by American bombing on October 7, 1944, after the operation had already failed. The rebuilt crossing was later renamed the John Frost Bridge in December of 1977, honouring the man who had held the original at impossible odds. The contrast between September 1944 and March 1945 is the measure of how far the Wehrmacht had fallen in 6 months. At Sonn, the demolition was perfect. At Nijmegen, there was a coherent command and a coherent defence. At Arnhem, there were 4 days of brilliant, doomed fighting against overwhelming odds. 6 months later at Remagen, the command had changed twice in 12 hours. The explosives were the wrong type and half the requested quantity. The detonator circuit was cut before it fired, and the officer sent to take charge arrived by bicycle with no radio and no staff. 2 weeks after Remagen, on the night of March 22 to 23, 1945, General George Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim. There was no bridge. The Germans had blown every crossing in that sector, but there was also almost no German defence remaining on the eastern bank. The 5th Infantry Division crossed in assault boats with no preparatory artillery bombardment, in complete surprise, achieving the crossing before German commanders on the far bank had even confirmed the attack was real. Patton called General Omar Bradley the following morning and said, according to Bradley's own account, "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." By evening, with Montgomery's massive assault beginning to the north, Patton made certain the world was told. A day later, on the night of March 23 to 24, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery launched Operation Plunder, the great set-piece Rhine crossing near Wesel, supported by over 3,500 guns, and the airborne assault of Operation Varsity on the morning of March 24. The German 1st Parachute Army, which had fought hard through the Rhineland battles under General Alfred Schlemm before Schlemm was wounded in late March and replaced by General Günther Blumentritt, could not stop it. Within 48 hours, the Allies had a major bridgehead on the eastern bank. By the end of March 1945, all 4 American armies on the Western Front were across the Rhine. None of the subsequent crossings required a standing bridge. They succeeded through firepower, engineering, speed, and the collapse of the German army on the eastern bank. The bridge that should not have been there at Remagen had accelerated the timetable. But by late March, the war in the West was already beyond saving. So why did German columns keep losing bridges at the worst possible moment? Not for one reason. For 5 that compounded each other. The first was command paralysis created by Hitler's own rules. After the Mülheim incident, no officer could act without written authorization. At Remagen, 3 separate German units reported to 3 different chains of command. The sector corps commander had been captured the night before. His replacement was 40 miles away, with no responsibility for this sector until hours earlier. His adjutant arrived 4 hours before the Americans, with no radio and no staff. The authority to act had been fragmented until it ceased to function. This was not a failure of nerve. It was a failure of architecture. The second was fuel. By March of 1945, Allied bombing of German synthetic oil facilities, begun in earnest in May of 1944, had reduced aviation fuel production to a fraction of its wartime levels and was strangling motor transport as well. German counterattacks on the Remagen bridgehead by armoured units, including elements of the Panzer Lehr Division, stalled partly because tanks ran dry before they reached firing positions. Engineering units that needed to move explosives and detonators to bridge sites could not always move their vehicles. Some demolition parties arrived on foot, too late, or not at all. Without fuel, the entire demolition system ran on foot speed, and foot speed was never fast enough. The third was the sky. By 1945, the Allies owned daylight over Western Germany completely. A German engineer could not work in the open on a bridge structure in daylight without being attacked by aircraft. Work had to be done in darkness, hurriedly, with reduced crews, using whatever materials had survived the journey to the site. The ferries at Remagen that might have served as escape routes for civilians and soldiers had already been destroyed by Allied aircraft in the days before the bridge fell. Every time German forces tried to mass at a river crossing, Allied reconnaissance aircraft saw it and directed strikes onto it before the day was out. The fourth was communication. Scheller's radio truck separated from his column in the dark and was never recovered. Captain Brache tried sending motorcycle messengers out of the Erpel tunnel, and they were shot down by American fire from the ridge above. Field telephone lines were cut by artillery as fast as they were laid. When the system that was supposed to carry written orders had no functioning wire or radio net, the written order simply did not arrive, and without it, under Hitler's rules, no officer could legally act. The fifth failure, and in some ways the most corrosive, was the system of punishment itself. The post-Mülheim rules were designed to prevent premature demolitions. What they actually produced was a rational incentive for every engineer officer to delay firing as long as possible, always hoping that the written order would arrive, always weighing the certainty of a court-martial for acting too early against the possibility of a court-martial for acting too late. The result was that some bridges were blown too early, trapping retreating soldiers on the wrong bank. Others were blown too late, or not at all. In every case, officers who exercised their own judgment in either direction faced the prospect of a firing squad. The system had made judgment itself a liability. What it preserved was paralysis. The story does not belong only to the Second World War. At the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, Roughly 500 Georgia soldiers under Brigadier General Robert Toombs held a stone bridge over Antietam Creek for about 3 hours against the Federal Ninth Corps. They never blew it. They held it with muskets. When their flank was finally turned by a crossing downstream, the bridge fell and the Confederate right collapsed. Determination could hold a river crossing for hours. It could not hold it forever. On January 31, 1942, British and Commonwealth forces completed their retreat down the Malayan Peninsula to Singapore Island and breached the Johor Causeway, connecting it to the mainland. Royal Engineers blew a gap roughly 70 feet wide in the structure. They breached it on clear authority, in time, with the right materials. It did not save them. General Tomoyuki Yamashita's Japanese 25th Army crossed the gap on the night of February 8th to 9th in landing craft and assault boats, and the British surrender came a week later. A crossing well denied is not a battle won. On the night of June 5 to 6, 1944, 6 British Horsa gliders carrying 181 men of Major John Howard's D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, landed within yards of the bridge over the Caen Canal at Bénouville in Normandy. The German sentries had been told there would be blank fire training that night. Both the Canal Bridge and the nearby Orne River Bridge were taken intact within minutes. The code word HAM signalled that the Canal Bridge had been captured. The code word JAM signalled that the river bridge had been captured too. The full message, ham and jam, sent back to England, confirmed both bridges were in British hands intact. The Germans defending those crossings lost them before anyone with authority to fire the demolition charges even knew the attack had begun. What happened to the men whose names mark this story? Alexander Drabik, the first soldier across the Rhine at Remagen, returned to Holland, Ohio. He worked as a butcher and later as a repairman at a cement plant. He received the Distinguished Service Cross. He died on September 28, 1993, aged 82, in an automobile accident in Missouri, on his way to a reunion of his old unit, Company A, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, 9th Armored Division. Karl Timmermann, the 22-year-old German-born American lieutenant who led the assault across the Ludendorff Bridge, received the Distinguished Service Cross. He served again in the Korean War. While on active service, he was diagnosed with a malignant tumor. He died at Fitzsimons Army Hospital in Denver, Colorado, on October 21, 1951. He was 29 years old. He is buried at Fort Logan National Cemetery in Denver. His daughter, Gay Diane, born 7 days before her father crossed the Rhine, outlived him by decades. Brigadier General William Hogue, who made the decision to take the bridge, rose to command at the highest levels of the post-war American Army. He retired as a 4-star general and died in October of 1979. Major Hans Scheller, the 31-year-old adjutant who arrived at Remagen by bicycle with no radio, commanded the bridge defense for less than 4 hours and was shot in the woods near Rimbach on March 14, 1945. His wife Liesel survived the war. His unborn child survived. The pension rights stripped from his family were restored after the war ended. Field Marshal Walter Model, who commanded Army Group B through both Market Garden and the Remagen disaster, refused to surrender when the Ruhr Pocket was destroyed in April. He walked into a forest near Lintorf, between Düsseldorf and Duisburg, and shot himself on April 21, 1945. The Ludendorff Bridge's 2 surviving stone towers on the western bank of the Rhine at Remagen have housed the Peace Museum of the Bridge of Remagen since 1980. The towers that once held machine guns looking east now hold photographs, scale models, and the personal effects of the men who served there, alongside a simple stated mission. Every day, let us work for peace with our mind and heart. The painted sign that American engineers put on one of those towers on the day of the crossing, "Cross the Rhine with dry feet," courtesy of the 9th Armored Division, is preserved in the collection of the United States Army Armor Heritage Archive, long associated with the former Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor. The bridge itself is gone. The stone piers in the river were removed in the 1970s as a hazard to navigation. The river runs clean where they stood. On the eastern bank, at the mouth of the Erpel Tunnel, where Captain Friesenhahn turned a firing key and heard nothing, the hill is still there. The tunnel is still there. The bend in the Rhine where the bridge once crossed is still there. The water moves the same way it always has, indifferent to what was decided above it. Across 5 years and 2 continents, the pattern holds. Bridges fall when commands cannot move faster than events. They fall when authority is kept too far from the men who must act. They fall when the fear of punishment outweighs the instinct to decide. And when all of those failures arrive at once, when the command is broken, the fuel is gone, the sky belongs to the enemy, and every officer knows that acting in either direction may cost him his life, the bridge does not merely fall. It becomes proof that the army defending it has already ceased to exist as an army. The men shot in the Westerwald woods in March of 1945 did not lose the war. The war had already been lost around them by the time they arrived at that river. They were simply caught at the place where the evidence became impossible to ignore. A river, a ruined structure, and a question no firing squad could answer. At what moment did the decision stop being about the bridge and start being about everything else that had already been decided?